Happy Sunday. This Sunday we're celebrating the third week of Easter, and we have the gospel of the disciples on their way to Emmaus. And during the next couple of weeks, I'd like to make some reflections on hope, because I think it's a theme that's very important now during Easter, and it's good to pull in the different gospels together. This week we look at the Emmaus disciples. The next Sunday we see Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Then we see him as the way, the truth, and the life. And then finally we'll look at him when he makes the promise of the Advocate, getting ready for Pentecost Sunday. And so we see the Emmaus disciples in hope. Today I want to begin with the story of the Emmaus disciples. Hope is what they were missing. For me, the saddest words in the gospel are words that we hear today. We were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. How sad is it that they who were so close to the Lord, not some of the apostles, but nevertheless some of the 72 disciples, men who were able to listen so often to Christ, but they had lost hope. These words indicate a loss of hope, of falling into despair. And so I was thinking about an encyclical from Pope Benedict, Spe Salvi, Saved by Hope. And there he says, redemption is offered to us in the sense that we have been given hope, trustworthy hope, by virtue of which we can face our present. The present, even if it is arduous, can be lived and accepted if it leads towards a goal, if we can be sure of this goal, and if this goal is great enough to justify the effort of the journey. These disciples had lost their hope because they no longer saw themselves on the journey with Jesus. We can often go through the same process that these disciples experienced. There's an initial excitement and a desire to follow Jesus. But then, before long, discouragement comes because things do not work out the way we had expected. There is a new encounter with Christ that leads to a rediscovery and a deepening of hope. Where does the initial excitement occur? It comes when one has a real encounter with Jesus Christ. For many of us, this may be simply a cultural Catholicism in which we were raised. Whereas for a long time, there is no reason to question the traditions with which we were raised. Our faith seems to be fine, with ordinary difficulties that do not overwhelm us. But then the arduous present comes. Often we do not have the trustworthy hope that Pope Benedict mentions in Spe Salvi. Just as the disciples were overcome by the despair at the loss of Jesus from their midst, we can be disheartened by our lack of control over our current circumstances. Our life is a constant struggle. We may not wish to rise to the challenge, but rather wallow in our own laziness. Hope begins to die. The trial seems too great to face, and we back down into failure. And we have that moment where sadness conquers our hearts, and we can even stop believing that God wants to play an active role in our lives. It must have been such a letdown for the disciples who were on their way to Emmaus. Their hope had been shattered because they thought that Jesus was a sham. He had seemed like a good preacher, and maybe he could even be the Messiah. His meltdown during his last days in Jerusalem seemed like an indictment of his power as a religious leader. His death on the cross seemed like a definitive denial of his power to change anything. Why follow a man who has just been crucified? But all hope is not lost. Jesus walks alongside them, just as he walks alongside us. He understands us. I've always been jealous of these two men on their way to Emmaus because Christ himself explained the scriptures to them. We need to make the experience of discovering Christ over and over again. These disciples thought that all was lost. Nevertheless, this was the prelude they needed to have a new encounter with Christ. Perhaps up until now they had been auxiliary disciples. Probably they never had the chance to speak personally to Christ. Now, because of their sadness and darkness which had taken over their hearts, they were able to open up their hearts in a personal and life-changing manner. We have the chance to do precisely this every time we enter into prayer. Jesus is waiting to hear the pain and suffering we have in our hearts. When we say it's hard to pray, we're almost saying that we have no suffering in our hearts, because that suffering can be precisely the beginning of our prayer. We see how Christ overcomes these apostles with his accompaniment, with his closeness, and how this changes everything for them. On this Sunday, may you walk a mile or two with Christ. God bless.